So voice biometrics is a biometric technology like many other technologies that you're probably familiar with, such as fingerprint, iris, and even DNA testing. So it turns out that we're all unique human beings. There's over 7.5 billion of us on this planet, and our voices are all unique. So each one of us has a different set of voice characteristics. And so we're actually measuring those characteristics, and there's two sets of characteristics. There's a group of characteristics that are physical. So we're basically measuring characteristics of your body, things like the shape and size of your vocal tract, and that will affect how your voice sounds like. But we're also measuring behavioral characteristics, and this is where voice biometrics is different from fingerprint, iris, and DNA, where we're measuring things that are unique to your behavior. And it's a combination of these two characteristics that we're measuring that makes voice biometrics unique. And these technologies are used to provide you access to systems, whether it's over the phone or in digital channels such as a mobile app or a website. So voice prints are stored in a secure database, just like you would have any other credential, whether it's passwords, PINs, or even other biometric modalities. There are a number of security technologies that are used to secure that data, but there's one key difference, one very important difference between voice biometrics and knowledge-based authentication. And that is, should a fraudster gain access to a database of voice prints, they wouldn't be able to actually do anything with that information. And that is a key security benefit that voice biometrics has over knowledge-based authentication, such as passwords. So although from a storage perspective, we just talked about how they're stored in a very similar fashion, right? So they're both secure, they're both encrypted. But the key difference is that if a hacker did get through all of these security measures and got access to the database of voice prints, they wouldn't actually be able to do anything with this information, which is quite different from a database of passwords or PINs or any other knowledge-based authentication, where once the hacker gets access to that information, it's game over. They have the keys to the kingdom and they can access all the accounts. So when it comes to privacy, the Nuance best practice is to have our customers inform callers and users of voice biometrics that that technology is present, and to give consumers the choice to use that technology or to use an alternative form of authentication. We believe very strongly that if you're open and transparent with consumers, they'll choose to use voice biometrics because it is more secure and it is easier to use than a username and password. So there's no security system that's 100% foolproof, but Nuance has developed several technologies to detect recordings and synthetic speech and other attack vectors. The attack vector that comes to mind for most people is a recording, because everybody thinks, well, that's a very easy way how to compromise the system. But in fact, it's not. Because we're able to detect the audio anomalies that are created during a recording process, we can actually fairly easily detect that a recording is being submitted instead of a live voice. So I often get questions about identical twins and impersonators. So a lot of people just think about, well, this could be an easy way how to compromise voice biometrics. The truth is that it's not, and for the very simple reason, as we spoke about earlier, that voice biometrics measures two sets of characteristics. They're both looking at physical characteristics and behavioral characteristics of the voice. So when it comes to impersonators, how impersonators sound like somebody else, they're mimicking those behavioral characteristics. And so when it comes to their physical characteristics, all those characteristics are off. And that's why the voice biometric system can very easily differentiate between an impersonator and the legitimate person. When it comes to identical twins, we're looking at the opposite set of characteristics. So their physical characteristics are very similar, but their behavioral characteristics over time diverge. And that's how we're able to differentiate between identical twins, which is something that is very difficult to do with other biometric technologies such as fingerprint or iris that only look at physical characteristics. A lot of us get a cold from time to time, but these kind of normal fluctuations in a person's voice don't affect the overall performance of voice biometrics. Again, because we're looking at a very large number of characteristics of the voice. And if I get a cold, then that affects the sinuses, and that's one out of many characteristics that we're looking at. However, if somebody has a more severe form of illness, such as laryngitis, where we really can't hear the voice or it's a faint whisper, then in those kinds of situations, the system will not work. But just like with any other authentication system, there needs to be a backup. There needs to be an alternative form of authentication. And that's the best practice that Nuance recommends to our customers. The key message to keep in mind is that Voice Biometrics has a much higher form of authentication rate than any other credential out there, including fingerprint biometrics or PINs, passwords, and security questions. The key benefits to customers are twofold. So on the one hand, it's a much simpler experience, right? You don't need to remember anything. You don't need to know anything. All you need to do is speak. It's something that we do very naturally. And on the other hand, it's also a much more secure form of authentication. And so it's this combination of better experience and better security that delivers the key benefit to consumers. So when it comes to the enterprise, there are several benefits. One of the key benefits is to deliver that better customer experience. And in turn, as customers have a better experience dealing with your organization, then that's going to improve their customer sat, their NPS scores, and that can have all sorts of additional benefits such as customer retention and increased revenue opportunities. Another key category of benefits is operational savings. So when it comes to calls into a contact center, if you can reduce those calls or make them shorter, that can represent very significant financial savings. So a third key benefit is related to fraud reduction. So Voice Biometrics, as we've mentioned several times already, increases security over PINs, passwords, and security questions, and over many biometric modalities as well. And so as organizations implement Voice Biometrics, they report significant reductions in fraud losses. So although no security system is 100% foolproof, Voice Biometrics has shown time and time again that it is more secure than other knowledge-based forms of authentication, such as PINs, passwords, and security questions, or other biometric authentication methods, such as fingerprint or facial recognition. One of the key reasons for that is the way that the technology works, that it measures a very wide set of characteristics. But also another reason why it is very secure is that Nuance has invested very heavily in anti-spoofing technologies. And so we can detect recordings and synthetic speech and brute force attacks. And so we have this very complete set of security technologies to ensure that the overall result is highly secure. So a false accept is when the incorrect user gets through the system. And so basically the Voice Biometric system is making a mistake. And that scenario is absolutely possible, but it's very, very infrequent. And there's several reasons for that. As we spoke about earlier, the system is measuring a very wide set of characteristics. So it would be very difficult for somebody to have all those characteristics line up with yours. Secondly, we have all the anti-spoofing technologies to detect if somebody is providing a recording or synthetic speech, or they're using a brute force attack. However, Voice Biometrics should be deployed in a layered security process, meaning that it's not the only technology in place to protect accounts. And that's where applying simple techniques such as locking accounts after 2 or 3 failed attempts in a row, or using a second factor of authentication come into play to provide a more holistic view of security. That would definitely be our best practice recommendation for high-risk transactions. So for example, if you were performing a very large wire transfer, Nuance would recommend to use a layered security approach where 2 factors of authentication were used. Probability of false accept is indeed higher with somebody who is genetically related to you because they have a number of characteristics that do line up with your own. However, the probability of a false accept, even with somebody who is genetically related to you, still remains minute, even though it is higher than with a random individual. And the reason for that, as we've mentioned earlier, is that there are a very wide number of characteristics that we're looking at, including behavioral characteristics. And that's why that even in the case of identical twins, we can see a divergence in scores between those 2 individuals that are very, very similar. So I often get asked, if a false accept is possible, why use voice biometrics in the first place? Well, I think what's very important to get across is that although no security technology is perfect, voice biometrics has proven time and time again to be significantly more secure than PINs, passwords, and security questions. Think about all the massive breaches that have occurred with passwords. These occur on a regular basis. We've all seen them in the news, and they lead to millions of accounts being compromised. That kind of attack is simply not possible with voice biometrics. And that's why our organizations that have deployed voice biometrics have reported significantly less fraud than they did when they were using PINs, passwords, and security questions. And just as a layer on top of it, right, there's the better customer experience. So not only are we improving security, but we're also making it easier for our customers to authenticate into their accounts. So from time to time, I read about these sensational stories that supposedly highlight security vulnerability in voice biometrics. And I think it's very important to stick to the facts. So if we look at this specific incident, first of all, we had a journalist that had solicited the help of his twin to try to compromise his account. He had provided his twin with his account information. So this is really a scenario where the legitimate account holder is being complicit with the supposed fraudster. The second key fact that we need to get across is that the system correctly rejected the twin 7 times in a row. And it's only on the 8th attempt that the system mistakenly recognized the twin as the journalist, and the twin got through. The third key fact that we need to keep in mind is that no fraud was committed. And so why is that very important? Well, fraudsters typically aren't complicit with the legitimate account holder. They're typically not the account holder's twin. And this is not how they perform their attack vector. And so this news story is really highlighting that voice biometrics, although very secure, is not a perfect security system, which is something that we've been very transparent about. What it is a security system that prevents fraudsters from perpetrating fraud, as they've been perpetrating fraud with PINs, passwords, and security questions, where they're able to compromise large scales of accounts with virtually no effort. So another way how this case could have been prevented is by simply locking the account after 2 or 3 successive failures. And this is actually a Nuance best practice, and indeed an industry best practice, to lock accounts after successive failures. But again, I think it's very important to keep in mind that voice biometrics, no matter how it's been deployed, has consistently proven to reduce fraud over PINs, passwords, and security questions. So obviously we want to get as close to perfection as we can, but even in cases where accounts don't get locked after 2 or 3 times, it has delivered very significant savings on the fraud side. Synthetic speech is an attack vector that has gotten a lot of media attention recently, but it's actually never been seen in the real world. And one of the key reasons for that is that it's actually very hard to create a synthetic voice, or at least a high quality synthetic voice of another person. And so how this attack works is fairly simple. First, a fraudster needs to collect audio from the legitimate account holder. Now, they need to collect a lot of audio in order to be able to create a high quality voice. The second thing that they need to do is to feed this audio into an algorithm that will create an artificial voice, basically a computer program that will simulate that person's voice. And third, they need to submit this simulated audio or synthetic voice into a system. And that usually means that they need to play it through computer speakers. And so if you break that down and look at all the steps that are required, each one of them pose quite a bit of difficulty for the fraudster and a lot of effort. Nuance has 3 separate layers to actually thwart a synthetic speech attack. The first is the voice biometric engine itself. And so it's actually very difficult to create a synthetic voice that mimics the voice characteristics of an account holder. The second layer is the playback algorithm, so basically a technology to detect a recording. As we mentioned earlier, a synthetic voice by definition is a playback of a recording. And so those algorithms are there to detect those audio anomalies that are created by the playback process. And the third layer of security that we have is an algorithm that detects synthetic voices themselves. So whenever you hear a synthetic voice, you may notice that it sounds just a little bit robotic. Even the very high quality synthetic voices don't sound 100% natural. And so the synthetic algorithm is a very sophisticated tool that's even better tuned than the human ear at detecting those very minute anomalies that define artificial voices. So let me actually show you how we detect a synthetic voice. So the first step that we're going to take is I'm going to authenticate into this app that allows me to log in with Voice Biometrics. The way this app is set up is that I need to speak a passphrase. So let me do that. My voice is my password. And so as you can see, within a split second, I get this green screen that basically indicates that it is the legitimate account holder's voice. It's not a recording. It's not a synthetic voice, so we can let them through. And so as a second step, I'm going to log in to the exact same application, but with a synthetic voice. And let me just tell you a little bit about how we created this synthetic voice. So Nuance is actually the world leader in creating artificial voices. If you've ever interacted with a consumer device that speaks back to you, there's a pretty good chance that it's been powered by Nuance technology. And so my colleagues brought me into a sound recording studio where I was put into a sound insulated box, and for about an hour I was speaking various sentences. And that audio, that very high quality audio, was then pumped into our algorithms to create a synthetic voice of me. And so that's what we're going to play back into the system. I'm just going to open my laptop here, get back into the demo application, and get back to that screen that's asking me to speak that passphrase. And we're going to have the synthetic voice speak that exact phrase on my behalf. Now let's see what happens.
My voice is my password.
So you heard the synthetic voice being pumped into the system, and instead of seeing that green screen, you see a yellow screen. That is basically the way that we indicate that it was a synthetic voice being played instead of a legitimate voice being submitted to the system.